So I can't imagine I'm the only person to say this, but I went into this show with imaginary expectations. I can't even say zero expectations, because zero still holds some abstract form of value. If it ended up being the worst thing I'd ever seen in my life, it wouldn't have really fazed me, is what I'm saying. But it definitely isn't the worst thing I've ever seen. It was clearly written by people with a decent grasp on the Fallout universe and who have some idea of how to pace and tell a story. With that said, it's definitely lacking that sharp satire and nuance that makes the better games so iconic and replayable, but it nails the more bombastic and simply fun aspects of the world. Anyway, let's get into the good and bad. We're doing this bullet point stream of consciousness style, so it's going to be all over the place, but I'll make sure not to spoil anything that matters without warning. I think episode 1 makes a pretty decent first impression. Our three leading characters, Lucy the Vault Dweller, Max the Brotherhood Squire, and Cooper the Bounty Hunter, were pretty well cast, Walton Goggins in particular, and they're established well and given unique respective goals that will inevitably tie together. Tonally and stylistically, it's a decent mesh of being faithful to the feeling of the games, Fallout 4 more so than the others, which is not my favorite by any stretch, but it's kind of the one you'd assume they'd emulate, so whatever. But with enough of your standard TV show fanfare to have a more widespread appeal. I think they did a sincerely good job finding that proper amount of quirkiness and humor that the better games have. You know, they didn't go overboard to where everything is super fucking dumb, but it also doesn't take itself too seriously and believe that it's doing more than it is. It almost feels effectively campy at times. I liked that the Vault Dwellers come across as super weird and naive like you'd expect, but in a believable way. I like how Cooper's journey is styled like a strange spaghetti western. I don't love the show's portrayal of the Brotherhood of Steel for a few reasons, most of which would probably constitute as spoilers. It beats out Fallout 3's generic hero chapter for sure, they're not that style, but they're not the zealous isolationists seen in some of the better iterations either, and they just behave in ways that make absolutely no goddamn sense. Again, kinda hard to expand on without spoiling everything, so I'll let you guys decide on that for yourselves. I know the Brotherhood is a bit of a can of worms to some Fallout fans, so I'm sure there will be a wide range of reactions. But to give a general outline of the season's plot along with my thoughts, our three heroes and their respective companions, which alternate between them in amusing fashion, are racing after a MacGuffin that all three of them need for a different reason. At some points, it feels like an episode of Spy vs. Spy with how they get the leg up on each other and how the tables end up turning. But in typical Fallout fashion, the side quests and general tomfuckery of the wasteland end up being the real star of the show. I can tell they really didn't want any one aspect of the program getting stale, and the end result is a season with a pretty huge variety of crazy shit. And outside of the three leads, we also spend a bit of time with the members of Lucy's vault, and they crafted a vault mystery that I think stands right alongside some of the more interesting vaults of the games. And I feel like constructing a good mystery is something the writers of Fallout games have always had a knack for. Even the Bethesda writers, who get so many things so incredibly fucking wrong, are really solid in that department, especially in a brief, isolated package. So even though it's not something commonly celebrated about the franchise, I'm glad that aspect was given some attention, and some competent attention, pretty consistently. There's also a decent chunk of time spent in the pre-war era where we follow Cooper in his famous actor days, and I feel like these are pretty hit and miss and more of the latter, even though Goggins is doing some seriously heavy lifting. They don't commit to the retro-futurist aesthetic of the series very well at all, and on top of that, I kind of feel like the pre-war lore of the Fallout universe only really works to full effect as a pure absurdist parody. And the show's attempts to inject drama and social commentary into it feel pretty contrived the vast majority of the time. But to commend one aspect of character writing as the show carried on, there was a really decent effort to convey a conflict between worldviews under the kind of pressure that the post-apocalypse presents, which is what you want to see from a show based on a series of dialogue-driven RPGs, and that's something that even the Bethesda Fallout games never really managed to do beyond the good and bad surface level. What I mean is, Lucy embodies this frankly naive level of idealism being tested in the face of human degradation. Maximus struggles to balance higher ideals with his own sense of envy and self-preservation, and Cooper is a man who lost any faith in the world centuries ago. So what you get is idealism, pragmatism, and nihilism coming to a head to see which holds true under scrutiny. Now, I won't pretend they fucking nailed this by any means, and this season of the show, at least, is much more concerned with explaining why people are the way they are than letting any character develop in a meaningful way, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't looking forward to seeing where these characters go. And now I kind of just want to talk aesthetics and vibe for a couple minutes, get those pieces out of the way. To start with the good, they built a few really cool sets for this show. The vaults turned out great, the bombed out areas were clearly put together with some care, and even a lot of the time they weren't on a set and were shooting on location, they picked spots really well. Sticking with the visuals, there's a fair bit of CGI going on, and you know how that goes, it looks perfectly 5 out of 10, but when they pull out the practical effects, they pretty much knocked it out of the park all across the board. There is some downright beautiful gore and environmental destruction. And a final positive, most of the radio bangers from the games make an appearance and they're used pretty well. Moving to the less positive, a minor pet peeve I have with Bethesda Fallouts is you'll go into buildings where people live and work and eat, and there'll be, centuries old fucking skeletons just laying on the floor next to them for no reason. We're supposed to be centuries past the end of the world and trying to rebuild, but most people live as though the bombs fell last week. They make their beds under heaps of rubble and garbage, even in places where they have the manpower and the know-how to rebuild. Don't even get me started on the concentrated 190 proof autism that is Megaton. Congratulations, you all win the Darwin Award. Anyway, if you're having a hard time visualizing why I have a problem with that, just compare it to New Vegas, where people are making an actual effort to live like fully functioning human beings, and the towns are much more practical and reflective of this. So anyway, at a couple points, the TV show kind of falls into that same trap of everything being made out of garbage and most people acting borderline feral because it's the end of the world and it looks cool or whatever, even though the more nuanced games in the series have already made a good argument for why that shouldn't be the case at this point. With that said, like I mentioned, it's definitely kind of a niche pet peeve on my end and probably not something that other people care about. Beyond that, the power armor looks kinda silly, I think most would agree. I'm taking into account the fact that if you really look at power armor in the games, it looks pretty silly there too, but this shit doesn't even look like it's made of metal, and being in so much direct sunlight is doing it no favors. It's not something that actually affects my enjoyment. In fact, I'll always appreciate the use of real costumes and practical effects over CGI whenever possible, but it would be disingenuous to not point out that the power armor looks like a plastic costume. Alright, we gotta go deep lore for a moment now. It's gonna get a little fucking dorky. There's that one major and weird plot point, spoiler alert by the way, about Shady Sands, which is the capital city of the NCR, being nuked in 2277, which I think is a considerable retcon just based on the fact that New Vegas takes place in the 2280s and heavily features the NCR, and I would imagine that if their fucking capital city had been laid to waste 4 years earlier, that shit probably would have come up in conversation once or twice. I've seen a little bit of cope about that online, with people saying that that explains why the NCR wasn't at full strength in New Vegas, and it's actually a really nice plot point. And, not to be rude, but that's really fucking stupid, because New Vegas provides a couple dozen actually good explanations for the NCR's weakness, and they have nothing to do with that. And that, combined with other little things like the Enclave apparently still being a considerably strong faction on the West Coast when New Vegas already gave them a near-perfect send-off with the Remnant storyline that now makes no fucking sense, just leaves me wondering why these writers had no respect for the established lore of the game that's probably most relevant to the events of this show. And it's not a situation like the Halo show, where they're just ignorant and incompetent and don't care. Like I said, the writers understand the universe perfectly well and just chose to piss on it when they could have told practically the same exact story without fucking up basically everyone's favorite game in the franchise. And I personally think Todd Howard gets a little more hate than he deserves, generally speaking, but when this fucking guy was involved with the show solely so he could make sure established lore wasn't ruined, why am I not surprised he didn't give a fuck about the better game that he happened to not make? Alright, I think that's out of my system. We're done with deep lore now. Another far more minor thing that's just kind of weird is this character Dane, who's a member of the Brotherhood and is one of those aggressively androgynous individuals. And you know me, you know I could give a rat's dick about adults doing weird gender shit, more power to you. But in fiction, when the entirety of a highly militant and frankly pretty intolerant faction living in the actual apocalypse is stopping to make sure they're affirming gender identities, or the lack thereof, I guess, it comes across as very forced and silly. Like, you even have the Brotherhood elder, fucking mega boomer here, spitting out they them like it's a completely normal aspect of his society. I mean, if you spend 10 seconds thinking about how humans actually function, you realize that all of that goes out the window the second the shit really hits the fan. But this is a show made for mass appeal in 2024, so it's a little expected. And it's not like it makes the story worse, it has no bearing on anything, really. But it does tickle the cringe bone a little bit. Anyway, when I take everything we just talked about and mix it all together, and I think about how they wrapped the season up, which was pretty good by TV standards, giving the important characters a satisfying arc while still cliffhanging the shit out of everyone, us fanboys in particular, I come away thinking, that could have been so much worse. It lacks subtlety of any real degree, but outside of the aforementioned lore issues, it does pretty much everything else really well. You don't need to know a single thing about the games to enjoy it, so if you're in that crowd, don't worry there. All in all, I see this as a win for Prime Video, and let's just hope they don't shit all over it in the next season. I'll talk to you guys later.